Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a world where the most disturbing aspects of human behavior, the truly destructive, insidious actions, could be understood not just as bad choices or sin, but as an actual identifiable psychological condition. Today, we're diving into a book that dared to propose just that, shaking up both the psychiatric and spiritual worlds. We're talking about M. Scott Peck's People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil. This controversial 1983 work represents Peck's ambitious attempt to bring evil from theology and philosophy right into scientific psychiatric inquiry. At its core, his central thesis is that evil is a specific pathological form of malignant narcissism, far beyond mere selfishness, and characterized by profound self-deception and the insidious act of scapegoating.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how Peck, building on his earlier hugely successful work, The Road Less Traveled, sought to provide a framework for something many people sort of instinctively recognize but maybe struggle to articulate. A persistent destructive malevolence that seems to go beyond ordinary human feeling or just making bad choices. So this deep dive will explore not just what he proposed, but why it resonated so deeply and why it stirred up so much controversy.
Indeed. So our mission for you today is to really break down Peck's audacious definition of evil. We'll delve into his vivid and often, frankly, disturbing case studies. We'll examine his most controversial proposals, including, a psychiatric diagnosis for evil, and even his astonishing claims about demonic possession. And we'll also analyze the fierce critiques People of the Lie received, and perhaps most surprisingly, its enduring legacy. Our goal is to extract the core insights, those aha moments, and the lasting impact so you can walk away well-informed about a book that, well, continues to spark intense debate and profoundly influences how we understand human nature. Right, so to truly get a handle on People the Lie, we probably need to first understand the man who wrote it. So who was M. Scott Peck, and what exactly set him on this path to bridge such seemingly disparate worlds?
Well, Peck was in many ways a product of the highest echelons of mid-20th century American education and the scientific establishment. Born in 1936, prestigious education. Phillips Exeter, Harvard, got his MD from Case Western Reserve back in '63. His early career was very much rooted in institutional psychiatry. He served in the U.S. Army from '63 to '72, rose as a lieutenant colonel, held some pretty significant positions like assistant chief of psychiatry, and after leaving the military, he set up a private practice in Connecticut from '72 to '83. And that period, that practice, really became the clinical crucible where many of the ideas for his most famous works, including People of the Lie, were truly forged and tested.
Okay, so very conventional, highly respected scientific background then. But you also mentioned his path was unconventional. What was his spiritual journey like?
Right, that's the other crucial piece. His conventional scientific background ran parallel to this really deep, unconventional spiritual quest. He was raised secular by Quaker parents, but he embarked on this personal journey for meaning. Explored Zen Buddhism, later Jewish and Muslim mysticism, and this all culminated in a non-denominational Christian baptism in 1980. He was 43. Now, the timing here is really important. It happened after The Road Less Traveled came out in '78, but just before he consolidated his thoughts for People of the Lie. And this conversion experience, it fundamentally reshaped his professional lens. It gave him a kind of theological vocabulary to describe psychological phenomena he felt secular science was, well, maybe ill-equipped to handle.
So he truly was a bridge figure then, spanning those two worlds.
Precisely. He was uniquely positioned. You've got the formal training in Freudian influence, secular psychiatry on one side, and then on the other, this profound personal engagement with spiritual traditions that were often dismissed by that same psychiatric establishment. The Road Less Traveled was really the first major product of this synthesis. It spoke the language of psychotherapy, but addressed this deep existential hunger, became a huge bestseller, really launched the whole spiritual self-help genre. And People of the Lie just audaciously continued this, applying that psychospiritual lens to the concept of evil itself. What's really key here, I think, is that Peck wasn't just a psychiatrist who happened to find religion. He was actively trying to legitimize spiritual language within a psychological framework for a mainstream audience. And that duality, that tension, is absolutely key to understanding both his massive popular appeal and, well, the significant institutional pushback he received.
In this book, it didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? What was happening culturally in the late 70s, early 80s that created such fertile ground for these ideas?
Yeah, you absolutely have to understand the cultural moment. The late 70s, early 80s, it was a period of pretty significant social and spiritual flux. The upheavals of the 60s had challenged a lot of traditional institutions, including organized religion. So for a growing segment of the population, especially the educated middle class, traditional religious doctrines were kind of losing their authority. At the same time, secular psychotherapy, with its emphasis on being value-neutral and detached from moral questions, often failed to satisfy this really deep-seated existential craving people had. It left a kind of vacuum.
So Peck sort of stepped into that vacuum, that space left by the decline of traditional institutions.
That's a really good way to put it. There was this profound cultural and intellectual vacuum. You had this large audience searching for moral guidance, for purpose, but maybe without what they saw as the rigid dogmas of traditional faith. And Peck's writing, with its accessible, almost non-scientific style at times, it addressed these spiritual cravings directly. He framed difficult emotions not just as symptoms to be managed, but as challenges for spiritual growth. The road less traveled had already shown there was a massive market for this kind of synthesis. And People of the Lie aimed at an even deeper need, the need to understand human malevolence in a way that felt both psychologically sophisticated and morally unambiguous, which raises an important question for us. In a society increasingly looking for meaning beyond conventional institutions, how do you even talk about something as fundamental as evil? Peck offered a language that was both complex-sounding and clear-cut, which was exactly what a significant chunk of the population was looking for.
Right. And from the very beginning of the book, Peck was really clear about his intentions. He was aiming for something pretty radical, a scientific psychology of evil.
That's absolutely right. His core ambition was huge. Take evil, a concept historically confined to theology and philosophy, and subject it to the rigors of scientific and psychiatric study. He argued that evil wasn't just some abstract problem, but a concrete, observable, and crucially diagnosable reality that clinicians actually encounter in their work. His explicit goal was that human evil needs to be studied scientifically.
And he knew this was dangerous territory, right? He even warns the reader.
He did. He was very aware of how provocative this was. He opens the book with this stark warning. This is a dangerous book. And the danger, as he framed it, lies in the necessity of making severely critical value judgments. You have to remember, this was in a therapeutic culture that really championed non-judgmental acceptance. So Peck's call to actually diagnose certain individuals as evil was incredibly radical. He acknowledged the potential for misuse, the self-righteous using it as a weapon, but he believed the potential for healing victims was worth that risk.
This raises a really crucial question for you, I think. Can you actually put a moral category like evil into a clinical textbook? Is that even possible? That's the tightrope Peck was trying to walk.
Exactly. He was attempting to create an objective scientific framework for a concept that is inherently subjective and deeply, deeply laden with moral judgment. That central tension, it just permeates the entire book.
Okay, so Peck wasn't saying everyone who does bad things is evil. He drew a really crucial distinction. So what actually defines a person of the lie in his framework? How does it go beyond just ordinary sin into this idea of malignant narcissism?
Yeah, he draws a very, very sharp line there. Peck starts by saying, look, all humans sin. It's universal. It's part of being human. But that doesn't automatically make someone evil. For Peck, evil isn't defined by how big the transgression is or even if it's illegal. In fact, he makes a point of saying the evil often present themselves as solid citizens, outwardly respectable. Instead, he says evil is characterized by the subtlety and persistence and consistency of their sins. But the absolute foundational defect, the core of it for Peck, is not the sin, but the refusal to acknowledge it.
Okay, so the core issue then is this refusal, this denial. How does Peck connect that specifically to his concept of malignant narcissism?
That's exactly where the two ideas merge. Peck argues that this refusal to acknowledge sin is rooted in a specific personality structure he labels malignant narcissism. Now, this isn't just everyday selfishness or vanity we're talking about. It's a profound pathological self-absorption. The evil individual, in his view, possesses what he calls an unsubmitted will, a core self that just absolutely refuses to subordinate its own desires or perspective to any higher principle, whether that's truth, love, the needs of others, or even God. And this unsubmitted will, it's coupled with this grandiose sense of self-importance, but also an incredibly brittle ego. It just cannot tolerate any criticism or any suggestion of personal imperfection. It's a fundamental kind of defiance against reality itself.
That sounds like a real, remoralizing of psychology, which must have been quite radical at the time.
Oh, it was absolutely a radical departure from the prevailing value-neutral psychotherapeutic norms of the 70s and 80s. Think about it. Where traditional psychology might diagnose someone with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, and describe their behavior in terms of dysfunction, Peck deliberately reframes that condition in explicitly moral terms. That unsubmitted will isn't just a psychological trait for him, it's a spiritual orientation, It's a fundamental choice against goodness. And this shift from a language of pathology to a language of morality, that's Peck's central conceptual move. He's essentially saying it's not just a dysfunction, it's a fundamental moral orientation, a defiant stance against reality. And, well, this is why it resonated so deeply with a lay audience, but also why it alienated him significantly from the scientific community.
Right, so if malignant narcissism is the foundation, then the lie is the very, I guess, cement that holds it all together. Can you tell us more about this central psychological mechanism, the self-deception and the refusal of guilt?
Absolutely. The lie is absolutely central to Peck's whole understanding of evil. He argues it's both a primary symptom and a fundamental cause. And the most crucial lie, the most damaging one, is the lie told to oneself. These people of the lie, as he calls them, are masters of self-deception. They meticulously construct and fiercely defend this elaborate internal reality where their own goodness, their own perfection, is completely unassailable.
And what's the point? Why all this effort at self-deception?
The entire purpose, according to Peck, is to avoid the immense psychic pain of guilt. See, for a relatively healthy person, guilt is a necessary signal. It tells you something's wrong, you need to correct your behavior, learn, grow. But for the person Peck describes as evil, the awareness of their own sinfulness, their own imperfection is completely intolerable. So their entire psychic energy gets devoted to this massive effort to escape it. They are, in a really profound sense, hiding from themselves. And crucially, this isn't just passive ignorance. Peck sees it as a willful active choice to reject reality in favor of this more comfortable self-grandizing fiction they've built.
So it's almost like an anti-therapeutic process then, isn't it? The exact opposite of what therapy tries to achieve.
That's a great way to put it. Peck describes evil not just as a state, but as a dynamic anti-therapeutic process. Think about therapy's goal. Bring the unconscious into awareness, confront painful truths, integrate difficult parts of the self for growth. What Peck describes as evil is the precise inverse, is the active energetic repression of truth, the refusal of self-examination, the violent rejection of anything that threatens that carefully constructed, perfect self-image. And this inherent opposition to the therapeutic process itself is why Peck concludes that such individuals are often, maybe always, untreatable in traditional therapy. They simply cannot or will not engage in the foundational work required. What's so fascinating here is Peck presenting evil as this deliberate, energetic resistance to psychological health. It's not just a lack of something good, it's an active pushing away of truth and growth. That makes it incredibly difficult for traditional therapy to get any traction.
Okay, so since they can't tolerate their own sin internally, where does it actually go? This brings us to Peck's concept of scapegoating, which, as you said, is quite chilling.
It really is, because the evil individual in Peck's model cannot tolerate the internal awareness of their own sin or flaws. They have to expel it, get it out of their consciousness somehow. And the primary mechanism for this expulsion is psychological projection, which then manifests behaviorally as scapegoating. So they project their own wickedness, their own faults onto other people, and then here's the chilling part, they attack those other people, those scapegoats, in this perverse attempt to sort of cleanse themselves, to restore their own internal sense of perfection by destroying the perceived badness outside.
He has a really potent definition of evil that ties directly into this, doesn't he? One that really captures his unique perspective.
He does. It's probably his most quoted and most chilling definition of evil. It's this: the use of power to destroy the spiritual growth of others for the purpose of defending and preserving the integrity of our own sick selves. That quote right there, that's the absolute core. That's the aha insight that defines Peck's unique view. Evil, for him, is fundamentally about the active, destructive self-preservation of a fragile, damaged ego. And it often comes at the expense of another person's very spirit, their very soul. And the targets, the scapegoats, they're almost invariably the weak and defenseless, people over whom the evil person has some kind of power or dominion. And tragically, the most common and profoundly damaging victims are often their own children. Think about it. Children are trapped, they're dependent, they're psychologically unequipped to defend themselves against a parent's projections. So the evil parent, in order to maintain their own illusion of perfection, systematically crushes the spirit and autonomy of their child, all while blaming the child for the very problems the parent has created or embodies. It's incredibly destructive.
And Peck connects this deeply to a theme from his earlier work, From the Road Less Traveled. It's not the kind of laziness you might initially think of, but something much more profound that he believes underpins this whole structure of evil.
That's right. He makes this really interesting, maybe counterintuitive argument that evil actually originates from a very specific and profound form of laziness. Now, he's clear. This isn't general slothfulness. Quite the opposite, actually. Evil individuals often expend enormous energy in their careers or meticulously maintaining their public image of respectability. The laziness Peck is talking about is a kind of spiritual and psychological cowardice. It's the refusal to endure the necessary pain of self-examination, the discomfort of conscience, the hard, arduous work of personal growth. Life, as Peck famously stated, is difficult, and growth requires confronting that difficulty head-on, facing painful truths. The evil individual in this model is someone who consistently chooses the easy way out when faced with moral and spiritual challenges. They refuse to undertake what Peck calls legitimate suffering, which he sees as the absolute prerequisite for developing a healthy soul. It's akin to the old theological concept of acedia, that spiritual weariness or apathy, often described as refusal of joy or effort. Not physical laziness, but a deep spiritual laziness that refuses the hard work of self-confrontation.
And to really pull all these threads together, Peck provides a kind of table, doesn't he, outlining the defining characteristics. Maybe we could just highlight a few of those key points for our listeners as a summary, because they really do distill his unique contribution.
Absolutely, that's a good idea. Looking at his defining characteristics of the people of the lie, several things really stand out. First, obviously, is malignant narcissism, that extreme self-absorption, that unsubmitted will. You see it clearly in the case study of Charlene, who couldn't reconcile glorifying God with her own overwhelming need for self-glorification. Second, self-deception, or the lie itself, is absolutely paramount. This elaborate system of lies, mostly told to oneself to avoid the pain of guilt. Think of George, whose obsessive rituals were, in Peck's view, a way to avoid confronting his deeper fears about life and death. Then there's scapegoating, projecting one's own unacknowledged sin onto innocent victims. Bobby's parents are the chilling example there. We also see a profound intolerance to criticism, a really ferocious resistance to any suggestion of imperfection. Again, Bobby's parents' angry, defensive reactions when Peck gently questions them are a stark illustration. There's also a huge concern with public image, this intense desire to appear good, to maintain an outward facade of moral purity, which helps them present themselves as those solid citizens we mentioned. And finally, there's the covert destructiveness. This is crucial. It's often not about overt illegal acts, but a subtle, consistent, persistent pattern of behavior that just kills the spirit of those under their dominion, like the cumulative emotional abuse inflicted by Bobby's parents. So yeah, this comprehensive set of characteristics, especially that emphasis on the unsubmitted will and the active nature of self-deception, really distills Peck's unique contribution. He's painting a picture of a consistent, recognizable pattern of behavior, not just isolated bad acts.
Right. And Peck didn't just give us these abstract definitions. He brought his theory to life through these incredibly vivid and often, yeah, disturbing case studies from his own psychiatric practice. Now, he changed details for confidentiality, obviously, but these stories are really the heart of his argument, and they seem designed to function almost as powerful moral parables for you, the reader. Let's start with the first major one, George.
Yeah, the case of George is the first big individual case study Peck lays out. George was, on the surface, this highly successful, orderly salesman. But he developed these really debilitating obsessive-compulsive symptoms, specifically this persistent fear that he had hit someone while driving his car. Now, Peck's therapeutic approach here was, well, quite aggressively confrontational. He didn't just see it as a neurosis. He diagnosed George's core problem as a profound moral failure, something he explicitly called cowardice. He argued that George's symptoms, these obsessions, were actually a manifestation of his deep refusal to face what Peck termed the legitimate suffering of his life. Things like a traumatic childhood, a failing marriage, and this deep-seated existential fear of death.
And this is where that striking metaphor of the pact with the devil comes in, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That's the central metaphor, the central drama of the case. George, who apparently didn't even really believe in the devil, makes this kind of deal in his own mind. Either his obsessions would cease in exchange for his soul, or maybe his favorite son would die if he gave in to his compulsions. It was a very strange internal bargain. Now, Peck interprets this not as a sign of psychosis, but as a conscious, though maybe desperate, psychological maneuver. A way for George to find an easy way out of his suffering, avoiding the hard work of facing it. The therapy sort of culminates in this really stark confrontation where Peck tells him directly, basically, George, you are a kind of coward. You're always looking for the easy way out, George, not the right way. The easy way. So this case serves as Peck's primary parable about that sin of sloth, or acedia we mentioned. Not physical laziness, but the spiritual laziness that refuses the really arduous work of self-confrontation. And what's really striking here, again, is Peck explicitly reframing a clinical presentation in these starkly moral terms. He's not just treating symptoms. He's challenging what he sees as a fundamental character flaw. linking it directly back to that core idea of avoiding necessary growth.
Okay, then we come to what is perhaps the most famous and frankly just horrifying case in the book. It's one that really sticks with you. It's the story of Bobby, a teenager struggling with depression after his brother's suicide.
Yes, this narrative about Bobby and his parents, it's truly memorable, mostly because of one incredibly shocking detail. Bobby was a 15-year-old boy, understandably suffering from depression after his older brother Stuart had died by suicide. The central horrifying fact that Peck relates is this. For Christmas that year, Bobby's parents gave him the very same .22 caliber rifle that his older brother had used to kill himself. Peck's account focuses heavily on his single therapeutic session with these parents, and he portrays them not as, outwardly monstrous villains, but as seemingly normal, respectable working-class people who are, in his professional assessment, absolute masters of the lie.
And how did they react when Peck actually confronted them about this truly disturbing gift?
Well, when Peck gently, or maybe not so gently, confronted them about the profoundly, let's say, problematic nature of this gift, their reaction is key to Peck's analysis. They didn't respond with remorse or insight or even simple confusion. Instead, they deployed this series of defensive maneuvers that Peck identifies as absolutely characteristic of the people of the lie. They rationalized their action. Didn't every teenage boy want a gun? They feigned ignorance about the implications. They even tried to project blame onto Peck, suggesting his reaction stemmed from some kind of class superiority. And crucially, throughout the interaction, they exhibited what Peck describes as a complete and chilling lack of empathy for Bobby's actual psychological state. For Peck, this was undeniable proof of their malignant narcissism.
So it was the subtle, almost hidden, spirit-killing kind of evil that he was really focusing on. Not necessarily illegal acts, but profoundly damaging ones.
Exactly. The parents' action wasn't illegal, but it was, Peck argues forcefully, profoundly evil in its psychological impact. It effectively communicated to Bobby, whether consciously or unconsciously, that perhaps they wished he would kill himself too. And this narrative also highlights a really key and controversial element of Peck's proposed methodology, using the therapist's own emotional response as a primary clinical datum. Peck describes his own intense dislike and even revulsion for the parents during the session, and he explicitly states that he trusts these feelings as a diagnostic tool par excellence, signaling to him that he is in the presence of an evil human being.
Wow, that's a truly chilling conclusion for a psychiatrist to reach, and it really pushes against the boundaries of conventional clinical practice, doesn't it? The idea that your own subjective feeling of revulsion could actually be a diagnostic sign.
It absolutely does. It completely reframes the therapeutic encounter, doesn't it? It turns it into almost a moral and spiritual confrontation where the therapist's gut reaction, their countertransference, is granted this kind of diagnostic authority that is, frankly, highly unscientific and incredibly susceptible to personal bias.
Okay, and the final major individual case study Peck presents is Charlene, a woman he describes almost as his teaching case for what he came to consider untreatable evil.
Yes, Charlene. She was a woman in her 30s whom Peck treated for several years, and he ultimately presents her case as the ultimate example for him of untreatable evil. Peck diagnosed her with a very severe form of malignant narcissism. He depicts her as someone who lives entirely by her own rules, refusing to conform to the expectations of, anyone, college, employers, even the basic therapeutic contract. He describes her as highly manipulative, even relating an incident where she apparently attempted to seduce him. And he emphasizes her profound lack of empathy to the point where she apparently gave another patient the creeps. Her spiritual journey, as Peck relates it, is particularly telling. She briefly joins a church, even teaches doctrine for a while, but then leaves. Why? Because she cannot reconcile the church's goal of glorifying God with her own overwhelming personal need for self-glorification.
And how did her therapy end? Did Peck manage to find some kind of breakthrough with her?
No, quite the opposite. The therapy ends not with any kind of breakthrough, but with what Peck portrays as a final, chilling act of control initiated entirely by Charlene. She announces it's her last session and then proceeds to behave absolutely perfectly throughout it. Why? In her own words, according to Peck, just to show Puck that she could. This leaves Peck feeling, as he puts it, completely flabbergasted and defeated. He concludes that his failure was in not recognizing her as truly evil much sooner. He even goes on to speculate that the only reason she wasn't thoroughly evil was because she had made the deliberate choice not to marry or have children, thus limiting the number of potential victims over whom she could exercise her destructive dominion. So Charlene's story serves as Peck's ultimate parable on the inherent limits of psychotherapy itself. It's his argument that when a patient's core will is fundamentally unsubmitted to the process of growth, to truth itself, then therapy isn't just ineffective, it's essentially impossible. Now, these narratives, Joy's, Bobby's parents, Charlene, they are incredibly compelling for a lay audience. But they really highlight a key tension in the book. They function much more like moral parables, meticulously crafted to illustrate his thesis, rather than objective, nuanced clinical reports. This makes them incredibly persuasive on an emotional level, but also opens them wide up to criticism regarding clinical objectivity, potential bias, and the ethical implications of presenting patients essentially as moral archetypes rather than complex human beings.
Right. And Peck wasn't content to just analyze evil on the individual level. He then asks this really chilling question. Can evil actually manifest on a collective scale as group evil? And he turns to one of the most infamous and horrific events of the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre, to explore this idea.
That's right. After establishing his model for individual evil, Peck dedicates a significant chapter to extending that analysis to the phenomenon of group evil. He posits that the exact same psychological dynamics that operate in the evil individual can, and often do, manifest on a collective scale. He even argues that group evil is, in fact, far more common and often far more destructive than the evil committed by just a single person.
So how does individual narcissism translate into a group pathology in his view? What are the mechanisms?
Well, Peck's theory of group evil is essentially a direct extrapolation of his individual model. He contends that groups, nations, organizations, even families just like individuals, can become malignantly narcissistic. They can develop a kind of collective ego that refuses to acknowledge its own flaws, engages in profound self-deception to maintain an image of righteousness, and routinely scapegoats other groups to project its own unacknowledged sins and failings. He identifies several dynamics specifically inherent to groups that facilitate this process. Probably the most important one he highlights is the specialization of roles within any group hierarchy. When tasks are divided up, he says, it becomes both possible and easy for the individual to pass the moral buck, the responsibility, to some other part of the group. And this diffusion of responsibility then inevitably leads to a diffusion of conscience, where no single individual feels fully accountable for the group's actions, even horrific ones. And this collective dynamic allows a group to commit atrocities that most of its individual members would probably shrink from if they were acting entirely alone. Which raises that important question again. How does our individual morality shift when we become part of a collective? Peck's point is that the group dynamic itself can create a kind of psychological shield, enabling behaviors that wouldn't typically occur in isolation.
And Peck directly applied this model to the My Lai massacre, an event he actually had a unique professional connection to, didn't he? What did he uncover there?
He did, yeah. To illustrate his theory of group evil, Peck provides this detailed analysis of the My Lai massacre. This occurred in March 1968 in Vietnam, where, as most people know, U.S. troops killed hundreds, maybe 500, unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, children, and old men. And Peck's analysis wasn't just theoretical, it was informed by his direct professional involvement. Back in 1972, he actually chaired a committee of psychiatrists appointed by the Army Surgeon General specifically to study the psychological aspects of the My Lai atrocity. So his central analytical question coming from that experience was profound.
How is it that approximately 500 men, the majority of whom were undoubtedly not evil as individuals, could all have participated in an act as monstrously evil as that at My Lai?
That's the crucial question. And what was his answer, focusing on these group dynamics he had outlined? Well, his answer deliberately rejects simplistic explanations like just blaming a few bad apples. Instead, he focuses squarely on the group dynamics operating within Charlie Company at My Lai. He points to factors like the intense psychic numbing that soldiers often experience in prolonged combat, the immense pressure to conform within a tight-knit military unit, and critically, a significant breakdown of moral leadership within that specific unit. The diffusion of conscience, he argues, was absolutely rampant. Soldiers were just following orders, or felt they were. The responsibility for the moral implications was passed up the chain of command, where it ultimately just seemed to dissipate, with no one taking full ownership. Furthermore, Peck analyzes the extensive military cover-up of the massacre that followed as a prime example of a gigantic group lie. And this, for him, is the crucial link back to his core thesis about individual evil. Just as the individual person of the lie uses deception to hide their sin from themselves and the world, the institution itself engaged in this massive, coordinated effort to deny reality, rationalize its horrific actions, and ultimately scapegoat just a few low-ranking individuals, like Lieutenant Calley. This, for Peck, just reinforces his fundamental argument that lying is simultaneously one of the symptoms and one of the causes of evil, whether individual or collective.
Hmm. But while Peck's insights into the group's internal psychology are certainly compelling, his analysis here also seems to reveal some of the potential limitations of his broader theory, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. While Peck's psychological insights into the dynamics within the unit at Miley are powerful and thought-provoking, his analysis can definitely be critiqued for its somewhat limited sociological and political scope. By focusing so intently on the group's internal psychology, its collective narcissism, its diffusion of responsibility, he arguably gives less weight to the broader systemic forces that created the conditions for the massacre in the first place. A more comprehensive analysis would likely place greater emphasis on factors like the brutalizing nature of military training itself, the dehumanizing indoctrination soldiers received, the pervasive racism directed against the Vietnamese people at the time, the immense strategic and political pressures of a brutal counterinsurgency war, and specific command failures higher up the chain that directly contributed to the tragedy. Peck's model is very powerful for explaining the how at the micro level of the group interaction, but is perhaps less robust in explaining the why at the macro level of politics, military strategy, and historical context.
And this focus creates a bit of a paradox within his own work, doesn't it? When you compare his view of individual versus group evil.
Yes, it reveals this central paradox, or maybe tension, within Peck's overall theory. Remember, his model of individual evil is fundamentally characterological. Evil is presented as this deeply ingrained personality structure, a who you are kind of problem, rooted in that concept of malignant narcissism. Yet his explanation for group evil, particularly at My Lai, becomes largely situational. He explicitly states that most of the soldiers involved were not evil individuals. So this creates a significant contradiction, right? If evil is a specific diagnosable character defect, how can essentially non-evil people participate collectively in profoundly evil acts on such a massive scale? His analysis of My Lai implicitly seems to concede that powerful situations and corrupt systems can generate evil behavior in otherwise ordinary people. And this insight, which has been famously explored in social psychology experiments like Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, suggests that a purely character-based explanation of evil might be insufficient on its own. It really forces you to ask that question: is evil primarily a property of the individual soul, or can it also be a property of the situation, the system, the group? Peck's own analysis of My Lai seems to highlight the limitations of his purely character-based explanation, pushing towards those situational factors explored by social psychology.
Okay, so moving on to perhaps the boldest and definitely the most professionally controversial part of People of the Lie. This was Peck's direct proposal to actually formalize evil as a psychiatric diagnosis. This was really his ultimate expression of trying to bridge theology and science, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. This was the pinnacle, you could say, of his ambition to bring concepts traditionally belonging to theology right into the heart of the scientific psychiatric domain.
He wasn't just talking about evil anymore. He literally wanted it listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. What did he actually call it in clinical terms?
Right. He argued quite forcefully that the pattern of behavior he described as evil was a consistent, recognizable syndrome that clearly warranted its own diagnostic category within the official psychiatric nomenclature, the DSM. He proposed it could be classified perhaps as a severe subtype of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, and he termed it either simply evil or, using more clinical-sounding language, malignant narcissistic personality disorder. Now, crucially, Peck made a very clear distinction between his proposed diagnosis and psychopathy, which is typically classified under antisocial personality disorder in the DSM. In Peck's view, the psychopath fundamentally lacks a conscience. They don't accept conventional morality, so they don't experience internal conflict about their actions, and thus have no real need for self-deception. The evil person, by contrast, according to Peck, does possess a conscience. They have an awareness of right and wrong. Their pathology, he argued, lies in the fact that they actively wage this willful war against their own conscience. They use that sophisticated mechanism of self-deception specifically to crush their own feelings of guilt and maintain their narcissistic self-image of perfection. So evil, in this specific framework, isn't the absence of morality, but rather a deliberate perversion of it. What's really fascinating here is how Peck tries to differentiate his concept of evil from standard psychopathy. He's arguing that the person of the lie is constantly engaged in this intense internal struggle, this battle against their own conscience, which is precisely what, in his view, makes them so insidiously destructive.
So, if we actually could diagnose evil medically, what would that even mean? For society, for the power dynamics within the medical profession, what were the potential implications he saw?
Yet the creation of such a diagnosis would have had profound and really far-reaching implications across several fields. For clinicians, potentially, it could offer a new lens for understanding certain patients who seem resistant to treatment. And perhaps even more importantly, it might offer a framework for helping the victims of their destructive behavior, validating their experiences. In forensic psychology, think about it, the introduction of evil as a recognized medical condition could radically alter debates about criminal responsibility, maybe even the insanity defense. However, the ethical dangers are just immense. And this is a fact Peck himself openly acknowledged. He expressed significant concern that the diagnosis could easily be misused as a weapon for personal or political ends. He even noted that one of the very characteristics of the evil people he described is their tendency to falsely label others as evil, as part of their scapegoating, and the power to officially medically diagnose a person as evil. Well, that would place an absolutely extraordinary and potentially corrupting level of moral authority directly into the hands of psychiatrists.
Unsurprisingly, this whole proposal met with pretty overwhelming rejection from the mainstream scientific and philosophical communities. What were their core objections to basically pathologizing a moral concept?
Yeah, the proposal was indeed overwhelmingly rejected, and for several really fundamental reasons. The primary objection, the one you heard most often, was that evil is inherently a moral, religious, and philosophical concept. It's simply not a medical or scientific one. Critics argued it's a judgment about a person's character, their choices, their values, not a description of a biological or psychological dysfunction. So to pathologize evil, they argued, is essentially to commit a category error. It's medicalizing what is properly a matter of morality. Furthermore, even if you tried, such a diagnosis would be practically impossible to apply with any kind of scientific objectivity. The diagnostic criteria would inevitably be subjective, relying far too heavily on the clinician's personal moral framework, rather than on empirical, observable, measurable data. It would lack both reliability, meaning consistency across different diagnosticians, and validity, meaning actually measuring what it purports to measure, which is incredibly difficult for a concept like evil. Many in the field saw this proposal as a really dangerous step towards creating a kind of psychiatry of judgment, where clinicians could essentially label individuals they morally disapproved of as being mentally ill.
Hmm. And some critics even went so far as to call Peck's proposal a kind of secular form of exorcism. What exactly did they mean by that comparison?
That's a really insightful critique, actually. Peck's attempt to formalize a diagnosis for evil can be understood from that perspective as stemming from a deep desire to create a modern scientific ritual for naming and containing a force that society finds terrifying and fundamentally incomprehensible. Think about traditional societies. The ritual of exorcism served a clear function. It identified a malevolent entity, it gave it a name, and it provided a structured, culturally sanctioned procedure for combating it. Now fast forward to modern secular society. A DSM diagnosis fulfills a somewhat similar social and psychological role. It takes a chaotic and distressing set of behaviors, it gives them a formal scientific-sounding name like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and it provides a framework for understanding, treatment, and control. So by proposing to add evil to this diagnostic manual, Peck was in essence advocating for a secular, medicalized form of exorcism. The act of a psychiatrist diagnosing a patient as evil would serve as the modern equivalent of a priest naming a demon. It provides a sense of cognitive control over a profoundly disturbing phenomenon by cloaking what is ultimately a moral judgment in the authoritative language and legitimacy of science. If you connect this to the bigger picture, it really reveals this deep-seated human need we seem to have for taxonomies of evil, for ways to categorize and manage it, whether those frameworks originate from religion or purportedly from science. Peck was trying to fulfill that need, but in a way that simply crossed too many fundamental lines for the scientific community.
Okay, so if the DSM proposal was controversial, this next step Peck took was, for many people, a complete and utter break with scientific credibility. He ventured into territory most psychiatrists wouldn't even touch: demonic possession.
Yeah, this chapter, on possession and exorcism,
Yeah.
it genuinely marks a definitive break with the scientific credibility the book, at least initially, seemed to aspire to.
Hmm.
It's a real turning point.
He actually claimed personal involvement in 2 cases that he ultimately concluded were genuine demonic possession. How did he describe this ancient ritual, this experience?
He details his personal involvement in 2 specific cases, where he became utterly convinced he was dealing with genuine demonic possession. Now, he presents himself not as some credulous believer jumping to conclusions, but rather as a skeptical scientist who was reluctantly converted by what he describes as just overwhelming evidence coming directly from his own senses and experiences during these events. He then makes this fascinating attempt to frame the ancient ritual of exorcism in modern therapeutic terms, actually calling it a form of psychotherapy by massive assault. This was clearly a direct attempt on his part to legitimize a practice widely seen as supernatural by cloaking it in the professional language of his own field, psychiatry.
And what did he claim to actually observe during these exorcisms? How did he try to reconcile these, well, extraordinary experiences with scientific observation?
This is arguably the most startling part of the entire book. Peck provides what he presents as clinical objective descriptions of apparently supernatural phenomena. He recounts, for example, in quite vivid detail, how one of the possessed patients, a woman he refers to pseudonymously as Becca, seemed to physically transform during the exorcism into something resembling a snub-nosed coiled snake. Now, crucially, he does not present this as his subjective impression or some kind of stress-induced hallucination on his part. He presents it as an objective, observable event that he witnessed. Based on experiences like these, he argues for the literal existence of Satan and demons as distinct non-human entities. He believed they could actually invade and influence human beings, causing symptoms that might mimic, but were ultimately distinct from, standard forms of psychopathology. He even goes so far as to develop a kind of taxonomy of possession. He distinguishes between partial possession, where the hosts remain separate from the demons and can therefore cooperate with an exorcism, and a theoretical state of total possession, where the human soul and the demonic entity have somehow fused into a single irredeemable being. And he speculates that perhaps the truly deeply evil individuals he describes elsewhere in the book might actually be cases of this total irredeemable possession. This is really where Peck takes a profound and, for many, fatal turn. He moves definitively from using religious concepts metaphorically, or as psychological analogies, to asserting their literal scientific reality. This isn't just a subtle nuance, it's a fundamental methodological crisis for a book that started out aspiring to be a scientific text.
So, what was the fallout from these claims, particularly within the scientific and academic communities? What impact did this chapter have on the book's overall credibility?
Well, for the vast majority of readers within the scientific and academic communities, this chapter just irrevocably shattered the book's credibility. While his earlier use of theological terms like sin and evil could perhaps be interpreted charitably as metaphorical or as a form of philosophical psychology, his explicit claims about witnessing exorcisms and demonic entities crossed a very clear epistemological line. By positing supernatural beings as actual causal agents for observable behavior, he definitively abandoned the foundational principle of scientific naturalism, the basic commitment to explaining phenomena through natural laws and observable processes. So this chapter really created a fundamental methodological collapse for the book as a whole. Peck began with the stated goal of studying evil scientifically, a project that inherently presupposes a commitment to reason, evidence, and naturalistic explanation. He ends by embracing a purely supernatural explanation for the most extreme forms of the very behavior he set out to study, based almost entirely on his personal, subjective, and ultimately unverifiable experiences during a religious ritual. This intellectual journey represents, from a scientific perspective, a methodological collapse. Ultimately, Peck prioritized his mystical experience over scientific epistemology, and in doing so, he invalidated the book's claim to be a psychology of evil and effectively transformed it, in the eyes of many critics, into a work of Christian apologetics, albeit a very unconventional one. What's fascinating here, though, is that unresolved tension. Peck's journey really demonstrates the profound difficulty of reconciling these different worldviews, the scientific and the spiritual, even for someone as intellectually driven and articulate as he was. Ultimately, it seems the scientific framework he started with simply couldn't contain or explain the spiritual experiences he believed he encountered. #X7. critical perspectives, and enduring controversies.
Okay, so given everything we've discussed, the controversial diagnosis, the exorcism claims, it's really no surprise that People of the Lie has faced some intense scrutiny over the decades since it was published. Let's try and unpack the major critiques, looking at it from different angles: psychology, theology, and even an examination of Peck himself. Starting with the psychological standpoint, what were the main issues raised with Peck's approach?
Yeah, from a purely psychological and psychiatric perspective, the book is indeed fraught with significant problems. Probably the most fundamental flaw is its profound lack of scientific rigor. Peck's entire thesis, his entire model of evil, rests not on controlled empirical research, but almost entirely on a small number of anecdotal case studies. And these are presented in a highly dramatized narrative fashion, designed for impact rather than objective reporting. His conclusions about the nature of evil are essentially sweeping generalizations based on his personal interactions with just a handful of patients. That's just not sound methodology. Furthermore, looking back now, many of his specific psychological assertions are considered outdated or even quite offensive. For instance, his description of autism as somehow representing the ultimate narcissism is a particularly glaring example of ignorance and prejudice by modern standards, and it's been thoroughly discredited. His tone throughout the case studies, especially perhaps in the case of his female patient Charlene, has also been widely criticized as paternalistic and, frankly, lacking in the kind of clinical self-awareness and humility expected in therapeutic writing. And ultimately, the book's diagnostic framework itself is seen by many as overly simplistic. It risks reducing incredibly complex personality disorders, which have multifaceted causes and presentations, down to a single, highly moralistic label, evil. And the danger there is that this approach risks promoting stigma and condemnation, rather than the clinical understanding and therapeutic empathy that are really the goals of modern psychiatry. It really raises that important question again. When you're dealing with complex human behavior, how do you balance creating a compelling narrative with maintaining scientific precision and ethical responsibility? Peck clearly prioritized the narrative power, and that definitely came at a significant cost to his credibility within academic psychology.
Right. And interestingly, even among theologians, the book wasn't universally embraced, despite its strong spiritual and even Christian leanings. What were their specific concerns?
That's true. While the book was certainly embraced by many lay Christians who found its validation powerful, it was viewed with considerable skepticism, even concern, by many professional theologians. One major criticism was directed at Peck's theological framework, which is often described as a kind of severe diabolic dualism. He presents the universe as almost locked in this perpetual struggle between two roughly equal opposing forces, God and Satan. Critics argued that this view, which sometimes seems to present evil as this ghastly cancer beyond God's control, actually has more in common with ancient heresies like Gnosticism or Manichaeism than with Orthodox Christian theology, which typically emphasizes God's ultimate sovereignty and power over all creation, including evil. His specific theodicy, his explanation for the existence and problem of evil, is also quite controversial. He essentially argues that God, having granted humanity free will, is now somehow impotent to prevent the atrocities we commit and can only grieve alongside us. This vision of a God of restraint, a God who reigns in weakness, is a very specific theological position that stands in pretty sharp tension with more traditional Christian conceptions of divine omnipotence and sovereignty. Many theologians also viewed Peck's overall system as a form of syncretism, a kind of eclectic blending of Christian concepts with elements of Eastern mysticism, particularly from his earlier Zen Buddhist explorations and secular psychology. They pointed out that he often reinterprets, or sometimes even seemed to deny, core Christian doctrines, like the substitutionary atonement of Christ. His theology often seems to be shaped more by his personal sense of what feels right, or what he thinks people need psychologically, rather than by a strict adherence to scriptural authority or established theological tradition. So if you connect this to the bigger picture, Peck's theological synthesis was undoubtedly deeply personal and quite innovative, but it departed significantly from many traditional doctrines. He was essentially constructing a spiritual framework that fit his psychological observations, and that inevitably meant bending or redefining some established theological concepts along the way.
Hmm. And then there's perhaps the most damaging critique of all, the one that goes right to the heart of Peck himself, creating this profound ethical paradox. He positioned himself as moral authority, yet his personal life was, by his own admission and other reports, deeply troubled.
Yes, this is indeed the most persistent, and for many readers, the most damaging critique. It's an ethical critique, and arguably an ad hominem one. But it focuses on the really stark contrast between the moral authority Peck claimed in his writing, and the acknowledged, sometimes quite public, turmoil of his own personal life. While he built this incredibly successful career, advocating for discipline, restraint, self-examination, and selfless love as the keys to spiritual growth, Peck himself admitted to, and was widely reported to have engaged in, a life marked by significant personal failings. These included multiple extramarital affairs throughout his long marriage, periods of estrangement from two of his children, and, by his own account, heavy use of both alcohol and marijuana at various points in his life. The charge of hypocrisy is, for many people, simply unavoidable. How could a man who demanded such total discipline from his readers as the solution to life's problems openly acknowledge and seemingly struggle with his own significant lack of it in key areas?
And what's truly provocative here, I think, is that question. Does an author's personal life actually invalidate their ideas, especially when those ideas are specifically about moral guidance and spiritual growth? Peck's story forces us to grapple with that directly.
It absolutely forces us to confront that question, yes. While some defenders might argue that an author's personal life is irrelevant to the objective validity of their ideas, the critique carries particular weight in Peck's case, precisely because his work isn't abstract philosophy. It's prescriptive, moral, and spiritual guidance. He presents himself very much as a spiritual guide, a guru even, and that makes the disparity between his teachings and his reported actions especially jarring for many readers. However, there is a more nuanced interpretation possible, looking through the lens of the wounded healer archetype, a concept often associated with the psychologist Carl Jung. This archetype suggests that sometimes the therapists or healers' own psychological wounds and struggles can be the very source of their insight and their ability to help others heal. Peck's life was clearly marked by significant personal pain. He spoke about depression in his youth, and he clearly had lifelong struggles with relationships and substance use. And his written work is intensely, almost obsessively, focused on the very concepts with which he personally struggled: discipline, love, the difficulty of relationships, self-deception, and of course, evil itself. So from this perspective, his books can perhaps be read not as the pronouncements of some perfected sage from on high, but maybe as the deeply personal, often quite desperate attempts of a man trying to create a framework to understand and combat the destructive forces he knew intimately from within his own life. Now, this doesn't necessarily excuse the hypocrisy, but it does reframe it slightly. The work becomes less of an authoritative moral guide, perhaps, and more of a tragic human document, a map of a territory he himself was trying and often failing to navigate. Which makes it less authoritative, maybe, but perhaps even more poignant as a psychological testament.
Right. So despite all these flaws, the academic rejection, the personal controversies, People of the Lie has undeniably had a profound and lasting cultural impact. It's really a testament to the power of its core message, or at least parts of it, that it continues to resonate so strongly today.
It truly has. Its legacy is really complex, and it touches upon the evolution of popular psychology, the public understanding of personality disorders, especially narcissism, and the ongoing broader discourse about human malevolence. It's had a surprisingly long afterlife.
So how did it specifically impact popular psychology and the whole self-help movement?
Well, together with The Road Less Traveled, People of the Lie really helped to solidify that entire genre of literature, the psycho-spiritual self-help book. Peck's great talent, his undeniable gift, was his ability to translate complex psychological and theological ideas into this accessible, compelling prose that resonated with a mass audience. He provided millions of readers with a new vocabulary, a new way to talk about moral and psychological issues. He popularized concepts like narcissism, scapegoating, and the critical importance of confronting painful truths as a path to personal growth. His work powerfully empowered individuals to view their personal struggles not just as problems, but within a larger spiritual framework. That message resonated deeply in a culture that was increasingly searching for meaning, maybe outside of the structures of traditional organized religion. Buck just had this undeniable gift for communication. He took these dense, often clinical or highly theological ideas, and he made them feel digestible, relevant to everyday life. He fulfilled a real hunger people had for moral and psychological understanding.
And perhaps the most significant and maybe surprising enduring legacy is its adoption by a very specific community, survivors of narcissistic abuse.
This is absolutely one of the most powerful and perhaps unexpected aspects of the book's long-term legacy. Decades after its publication, People of the Lie is still frequently cited in online support groups, forums, and by survivors of toxic family systems or relationships as a truly seminal work. A book that provided them with a crucial framework for understanding their trauma. And the reason for this powerful, enduring resonance seems to lie in what you might call the book's phenomenological accuracy. While academic psychology might describe narcissistic personality disorder using clinical, emotionally detached language, Peck's descriptions of the people of the lie, their behaviors, their manipulations, their impact, seem to capture the lived experience of their victims with this uncanny, often chilling precision.
So it really validates their experience in a way that maybe more detached clinical language simply cannot.
That's exactly right. His vivid depiction of their subtle and covert destructiveness, their fanatical concern with public image, their absolute intolerance to any form of criticism, their intellectual deviousness, and particularly their cruel scapegoating of children. All of this deeply validates the often confusing, reality-denying, isolating experience of those who have been abused by someone with malignant narcissistic traits. So the book's primary cultural function in many ways has become one of profound validation for these survivors. For victims of covert psychological abuse whose reality is so often denied by the abuser and frequently misunderstood by outsiders, Peck's work serves as this powerful affirmation. You're not crazy, this is real. And his use of strong, morally charged language like evil and lie, while problematic scientifically, actually matches the emotional intensity of the victim's experience in a way that neutral clinical terminology simply cannot. By daring to label the behavior as evil, Peck cuts through the abuser's carefully constructed facade of normality and respectability. He validates the victim's deep-seated perception that what they endured was profoundly and fundamentally wrong. So in this very specific sense, People of the Lie has arguably succeeded as a kind of therapeutic text for the public, providing clarity and solace to countless individuals, even as it demonstrably failed as a rigorous scientific text to the Academy. What's fascinating here is that the book's very failure in academic circles, its moral language, its lack of detachment, is precisely what made it such a success, such a lifeline for many survivors. The direct naming of evil provided a validation that detached clinical terminology simply couldn't offer them.
And beyond that specific community, Peck's work, despite its lack of academic rigor, arguably made a unique contribution to how we talk about evil itself, particularly maybe its focus on what we might call mundane or banal evil.
Yes, I think that's a really crucial point about its broader contribution. While most formal studies of evil, both historically and psychologically, tend to focus on these extreme, almost unimaginable world historical events, the Holocaust, genocide, or maybe on the minds of serial killers and violent criminals, Peck's primary focus was actually on this much quieter, more hidden destructiveness. The kind of evil that takes place not in concentration camps or on battlefields, but within ordinary families, within churches, within workplaces, within communities. By locating evil, or at least the potential for it, in the everyday interactions of seemingly normal people, Peck made the concept feel immediate, personal, and profoundly relatable, even if uncomfortable. It forced readers to confront the possibility of evil not just out there in distant monsters, but potentially much closer to home in their own lives, in their own relationships, and even uncomfortably as a potential within themselves. If you connect this to the bigger picture, Peck really brought the conversation about evil down from the geopolitical or the extremely criminal to a much more personal, everyday level. He made it less about grand historical atrocities and much more about the insidious, damaging dynamics that can unfortunately play out in our most intimate relationships.
So, where does this all leave us? What does it all mean? People of the Lie is clearly this deeply paradoxical work. It's challenging, it's full of powerful insights, but it's also undeniably profoundly flawed. Let's try and give our final assessment of its core strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, it really is a book of contradictions. I think this book stands as a kind of testament to both the compelling power of personal conviction and insight, and also the significant challenges inherent in applying rigorous scientific method to the deepest aspects of human nature. Its greatest strengths, I'd say, lie in its compelling, often beautiful prose, its absolutely fearless engagement with one of humanity's most difficult and disturbing subjects, and its really powerful, intuitively resonant descriptions of the narcissistic personality in its malignant form. Peck's analysis of the dynamics of self-deception, the active refusal of guilt, and the insidious mechanism of scapegoating that provides a coherent and psychologically resonant model for understanding a particular, very damaging type of human destructiveness. And as we just discussed, arguably its most important and lasting contribution, maybe unintentionally, has been the validation and clarification it has offered to so many victims of covert emotional and psychological abuse. However, its weaknesses are equally substantial, and we can't ignore them. The book is built almost entirely on a foundation of anecdotal evidence, not rigorous scientific research. Its diagnostic and theological frameworks are highly idiosyncratic, deeply personal to Peck, and ultimately problematic from both scientific and mainstream theological perspectives. The author's ambitious attempt to integrate science and religion ultimately collapses, most dramatically in that chapter on exorcism, where he abandons naturalistic explanation altogether. And finally, as we discussed, there's the author's ethical shadow, that unavoidable contradiction between his moral prescriptions for others and the acknowledged complexities and failings of his own personal life. So yeah, its strengths really lie in its descriptive power and its profound emotional resonance, while its weaknesses stem primarily from its methodological overreach and its subjective foundations.
Okay. So for you, the modern reader, listening to this now, how should you approach People of the Lie today, given this really complex profile? What's the best way to engage with it critically?
That raises that important question again. How do we extract valuable insights from a source that we know is flawed? I think for the modern reader, it's absolutely essential to approach People of the Lie with a high degree of critical awareness. It should definitely not be read as a definitive scientific text on personality disorders. It's not that. Nor should it be read as a work of orthodox Christian theology. It's not really that either. Rather, I think it's best understood as pioneering, deeply personal, and ultimately flawed exploration of human malevolence, conducted from a truly unique psycho-spiritual perspective that was very much Peck's own. So the reader's probably best advised to focus on the book's rich, phenomenological descriptions of narcissistic behavior. Those descriptions of how this behavior looks and feels remain remarkably insightful and chillingly accurate for many people who've encountered it. But at the same time, you need to maintain a really healthy skepticism toward the overarching diagnostic and theological conclusions that Peck draws from those observations. Maybe read the case studies less as objective clinical data and more as illustrative parables, powerful stories designed to illuminate his specific concepts, rather than definitive proof of them. So the advice really is, appreciate Peck's vivid, often profound descriptions of human experience, but critically evaluate his scientific and theological claims. Don't swallow it whole.
And ultimately, Peck's whole ambitious project, even in its failures, seems to highlight this enduring struggle, doesn't it? That unresolved tension between science and religion when it comes to truly understanding human nature, especially its darker side.
It really does. People of the Lie is in itself a deeply paradoxical work, precisely because it embodies that inherent difficulty, maybe even impossibility sometimes, of reconciling scientific and religious worldviews when confronting the profound reality of human evil. The book's very structure, its intellectual journey, reveals the limitations on both sides. It demonstrates, perhaps, that a purely secular, value-neutral psychological model can feel limited in capturing the profound moral weight and the perceived spiritual dimension of true evil. But at the same time, it also starkly reveals the limitations of a purely religious model when it comes to providing a scientifically grounded, psychologically nuanced explanation for complex, destructive human behavior. M. Scott Peck's great ambition, his driving force, was clearly to create a synthesis, a bridge that could somehow span this divide. That he ultimately failed in achieving that perfect synthesis seems clear. But the book's enduring power, why we're still talking about it today, might lie less in its conclusions and more in the courage and the raw intellectual honesty of the attempt itself. It leaves the reader, even the critical reader, with perhaps a deeper appreciation for the enduring mystery of goodness and the stubborn, intractable problem of evil in human life.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into M. Scott Peck's People of the Lie. Wow, what an incredible journey through a mind that truly dared to ask some huge, deeply uncomfortable questions.
It really leaves us to ponder, doesn't it? How do we, individually and collectively, continue to navigate that complex space between our scientific understanding of behavior and our intuitive moral compass, especially when we're confronted with actions or patterns that seem to defy easy explanation?
So for you, our listener, here's something to consider as we wrap up. If evil truly is, at its core, as Peck suggests, a fundamental refusal to acknowledge our own imperfections and the often painful truths of life, what small lies do we, perhaps as individuals or maybe even as groups or societies, tell ourselves to avoid facing our own legitimate suffering? And what might be the unseen cumulative cost of those seemingly small self-deceptions?